Right, thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. I've previously circulated a letter outlining the issues in this case.
Excuse me, sorry, Mr. Hull, if you could just wait for a little while, your application will come up.
Sorry.
You'll just be sitting quietly for a while, and I'll call you to speak. There's a few items on the agenda before we actually start the application, but I'm pleased that you're ready. So that's great. So let's start. Good morning and welcome to the June Planning Committee meeting. My name is Councillor Vine Hall. This meeting is being held remotely and is being live streamed via YouTube, and the recording of it will be available after the meeting on the website. Councillors and officers are reminded to put their mobile phones on silent if they have one near them, and committee members only, please leave your cameras on and mute your microphones when not speaking, as this will reduce feedback and background noise and saves with bandwidth to prevent loss of connection. The first thing I'm going to do is a roll check of the members who are expected to attend. And so as I mention your name, would you turn your microphone on and just confirm your attendance? So starting at the top, Councillor Mary Barnes.
Present.
Councillor John Barnes, who's substituting for Jonathan Johnson.
Present.
Councillor Sam Coleman.
Present.
Councillor Gary Curtis.
Present.
Councillor Sarah Errington.
Good morning.
Present. Thank you. Councillor Brian Drayson.
Present.
Councillor Tony Ganley.
Present.
Councillor Kathy Harmer. Councillor Kathy
Present.
Harmer. Thank you.
Present.
Councillor Lynn Langlands.
Present.
Councillor Chris Madeley.
Madeley, thank you.
My apologies. Councillor Andrew Mear.
Present.
Councillor Jeanette Stevens.
Present.
Councillor Richard Thomas.
Present.
We also have substitutes who are here today. Councillor Paul Cortell.
Present.
Councillor Howard Norton.
Present.
Councillor Hazel Tempe.
Present.
And other members who are joining us today are Councillor Mrs. Vicky Cook.
Present.
Councillor Doug Oliver.
Present.
And Councillor Field.
Present.
Officers joining us today are Tim Hickling, who is the Head of Strategy and Planning, who I assume is present. Tim, could you just indicate you're with us?
Yes, present.
Thank you. And Sam Batchelor, who is our Development Manager.
Yes, present.
Thank you very much. We also have 3 technical staff available today to help with the operating the system in the live broadcast. We have Claire, Chris and Kieran. Democratic Services Officer and the committee clerk today is Julie Holland. Julie, could you just indicate you're here?
Present.
Thank you very much. Members of the committee will be making decisions today by named vote. At that point, Julie will call out each member and in turn they will either answer for, against or abstain. Please remember to turn your microphone on before you vote. Because of the new format, members are encouraged to make their comments even more succinctly than they normally might do to ensure the smooth running of the meeting. However, should a member lose connection, I will stop the meeting for 2 minutes to enable the connection to be restored. If your connection cannot be restored within 2 minutes, the meeting will proceed and you will not be allowed to vote. Should you lose connection during an application, I expect you to advise so when it comes to the vote. Those members who wish to speak, please indicate by typing your surname only in the chat facility. It is a good idea to have your name sort of pre-typed in so you can just push the send button. It makes it a little quicker. The chat facility is persistent. That means it can't be deleted. And I would ask to avoid any inappropriate use because it could generate a code of conduct matter. Please also use this facility when proposing and seconding. I'll ask members who have asked a question if they wish to come back after receiving a response, so there's no need to type your surname into the chat facility again. And speakers either for or against an application and parish, town and council representatives have had the opportunity to register to speak at this meeting. I will call speakers after the officers have presented the applications, and there will be an opportunity for members to ask questions of these speakers. Members wishing to ask questions of the speaker should indicate to me via the chat, as we've already discussed. I will simply call each member in order, but be aware that should this become problematic for any reasons, I may have to limit the number of speakers. One hopes that doesn't happen. Speakers will be asked to leave the meeting once the application they are registered to speak at has been completed and a vote taken. They can continue to watch on YouTube should they wish. It is a requirement that all members will have read the paperwork published on the website, and if necessary, we will stop for a comfort break. But if we do, please do not press the leave meeting button. Just turn your cameras and microphones off and return promptly after the appropriate time that's been announced. During that time, there will be an appropriate message on the YouTube site. We will consider all the applications in order they're shown on the paper. And just again, please be aware that there can be a short time delay of a few seconds whilst a member appears on screen. So we just have to slow what we do down a little bit. Again, each item will be introduced in order, and the first item on the agenda is actually the election of the chairman. So I'm now going to hand over to the Democratic Services Officer, Julie Holland, to do that.
Okay, members, so it's agenda item 1, so it's election of chairman. Do I have a nomination and a proposer?
Councillor Projak, I nominate Councillor Vinehall as chairman.
And do I have a seconder for that?
Yes, Councillor Meir, I second that.
Okay, and are there any other nominations? As there are no other nominations, there'll be no need for me to do a roll call. All I just need you to do is to wave at the screen and say that you're in agreement. Everybody's happy? Okay, then congratulations, Councillor Vinehall, you're now chair, and I will hand back over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the members of the committee for supporting that proposal. I very much appreciate it, and we'll continue to try and work hard so that we have good meetings. The second item on the agenda is the election of the vice chairman. Do I have a proposer for the vice chairman?
Councillor Sam Coleman. I'd like to nominate Councillor Sue Proshak. I reckon she's going to be an excellent vice chair once more for another year.
Thank you. Do I have a seconder for that nomination?
Yes, I would like to second that. Councillor Lynn Langland.
Thank you. Have a proposer and a seconder. Julie, do you want to take a vote on this?
No, if there's only one nomination, we don't need to, as long as you're all in agreement again. So if you'd just like to wave at the camera.
Thank you very much for your support. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I look forward again to working with Sue Prochak, who's been incredibly supportive this year in helping me with my first year as chairman. So the third item on the agenda are the minutes, and can I ask you to authorise me to sign the minutes of the planning committee, which we held on the 28th of May?
So moved.
Thank you. Could I have apologies for absences and substitutes, Julie?
So we have apologies from Councillor Johnson, and Councillor Barnes is standing in as his substitute today.
Thank you very much. Do we have any additional items for this agenda?
No, we don't.
Good. Do we have any withdrawn applications?
No, we don't.
Could I have disclosures of interest, please? Yes, Councillor Barnes.
Yes, in fact, I'll speak for my husband as well. We have a personal and prejudicial interest in item 10, 2020-865P.
Thank you very much. Well, at the appropriate time, if you will remind us before the application.
Chairman, could they please explain the reason why they've got a personal and prejudicial interest, please?
Thank you.
We both are friends and working colleagues of Councillor Brown, and I think the man on the Clapham Omnibus would certainly say that we have a prejudicial interest.
All right, Julie?
Yes, that's fine. Thank you very much.
All right, we are now moving on to the applications, and the first application is RR2019/27508P, which is Watlington St Mary Magdalene Church, land southwest of. So if I could ask Sam Batchelor, too many Sams. Yeah. Yes, he's not prepared, Sam Coleman. If we have Sam Batchelor, who is our development manager, present this, and then we will have, I will invite Martin Hull to speak. Before Martin, you speak, I'll just explain to you the process. Yeah. So if you just don't launch into your speech until I've had a few words, if you don't mind. All right, please, Sam.
Good morning, councillors. Thank you, Chair. Yeah, this is a novelty for me. This is my first one. So no baby in tow with me today. So hopefully we're all going to run quite smoothly. Okay. So yes, Councillor Vinehall just introduced the application, St Mary Magdalene Church, land southwest of. This is an application of 2 parts. So I'll now start sharing my presentation with you to explain that in a bit more detail.
Just before you continue, Sam, could I mention that there was an additional item submitted, which everyone has a copy of?
Yes, thank you, Councillor Vinehall. I will also cover parts of that as part of this as well, but thank you for reminding members of that. So yes, this is an application of 2 parts really. We've got the construction of a car park to serve the church, and the erection of a detached dwelling. And yes, you have been circulated with an update sheet just to explain a number of updates. So the main one for you is that in your actual original agenda, the site plan at the beginning of the report is incorrect and doesn't match the site plan, or didn't match the site plan that was submitted with the planning application. That's now been corrected, and you should have a new site plan with your committee updates. Nonetheless, as part of this presentation, I will also show you the site. We've also received clarification both from the agent acting on behalf of the applicant and also from our own legal services that the Section 106 discharge that was mentioned in the report has now been finalised. That Section 106 related to a previous application and essentially tied the land and restricted it from some forms of development. So that's now been lifted and doesn't exist anymore. As I said, it's been discharged. And otherwise, the committee update summarises that which I believe Mr. Hull is going to cover when he's able to speak to you. So, as I said, an application of 2 parts, a car park and a new dwelling. Now, they are, despite the fact they're 2 distinctly separate forms of development, actually related in this application because the applicant has put forward an enabling development argument of sorts, such that the provision of the car park will create highway safety and community benefits by the continued running and expanded running of the church as a facility. But in order to provide that, they need to be able to fund it. And from their perspective, and after investigating other options, the best way to fund that is by the provision of a new dwelling, the proceeds of which will contribute towards this. So this is the application site that we have before us. It's this red line area here. It goes a bit purple because I think there's a blue line covering it, but essentially it's this area where my mouse is following the line. The church, just so you're aware, is located over here. This is an outline planning application as well, just to remind members. What we're seeking to approve here is the principle of the developments proposed, and the only thing that you would be explicitly determining one way or the other is the access. So the access is located just here, but the illustrative plans submitted with the application show a plot for a house, possibly a detached garage, and then also the car park area here. Now you'll also notice, if I can zoom in ever so slightly, that the car park will include a path that goes along to allow an easier access from that area to the church. Now here are some drawings just to show you a bit of kind of landscape context, I suppose, and topographical context. So you've got the church and these buildings here. I believe that the top sections show an existing situation, the bottom sections showing an indicative proposed situation, because again, to remind you, that isn't necessarily the scale and design of the house, although the information submitted with the application does explain that the development has been based in this instance on a 4-bed detached dwelling, but that just shows the relationship of the church to that possibly. So these kind of coloured bits that you can see, and maybe sporadic bits along here, that's the car park area with some screening, and there's an indicative indication of the scale of the house. I'm not quite sure the quality of them, so bear with me, but I'll just zoom in, and here's some photographs that are shown in this plan just to show the existing highway situation, where the access is proposed, kind of its verdant character, and also where it would just kind of enter onto the road. Again, some more sections for you. And then this is just a wider OS extract, just to show you the site in relation to the kind of immediate surrounding land. So again, the church is here. Some of the car parks that I mentioned to the report, there are 2 kind of parking areas facilitating the church, one to the side over here, which is about 4 spaces, one in front, which I think is mentioned in the report, about 2 spaces. The village car park is up here. I believe that's the village hall there, and there's some car parking to the side of it.
If I could just interrupt for one moment, Sam, we're not seeing the pointer as you're pointing these things out, yeah?
That's all right. I can use a different tool. There you go. Can you see that pointer?
That's better, yes. Just indicate, start again with the church, yeah?
Yeah, so the church is here. The report mentions that there are some parking spaces available, not many to the church, a couple in front of it, and there's an access point through here. And then there's also a track through here, which is the one in the report that's mentioned as a private track that I understand leads to a parking space for a few vehicles up here. This is the village hall, so just where I got to previously, that's up here. And there's a village hall car park that's there. I believe in the report it mentions there's about 4 spaces there for that. But it just shows you as well the road that runs through the area and just the distance that might need to be travelled from one place to another. I'll turn that off. Bear with me a second. Continue, and then just some photographs as well, just to give you a kind of little bit more of an idea of the surrounding area. Photograph of the church, obviously. This is a photograph taken from the churchyard, looking out into the kind of wider kind of countryside, just to give you an understanding of what is surrounding it on that side, looking away from the road, so looking out in towards the countryside. This is the path that leads from the front of the church down to the road. So again, showing part of the graveyard there. This is a view, I believe it's taken either in the field or in the churchyard, but nearer to the church, looking back at the nearest existing house, which was nearest existing house southwestwards, which I think was called Oaklands or something along those lines. Anyway, the plot would be this side of the hedge that you can see, or that hedgerow, that tree row that you can see in front of you. So it'd be in front of that picture. And again, this is a view taken further back. In fact, actually, I'll get the pointer up again just to point out some features to you. This is taken from the churchyard again, looking back towards that existing property to the southwest, which is here. And so the access would be, I believe, located somewhere between this conifer row here. So then you're talking about a car park area and the path coming up to the yard here, and then the plot for the house being in front of the existing, or to the side of that existing property there. So that's the application information. But yeah, just to go back to the kind of the crux of the matter from the case officer's perspective, an application of 2 parts, but linked together in so much as one is justified in order to provide the other. However, the conclusion that the case officer has come to is that whilst the provision of the car park does indeed provide highway safety and some community benefits, the report also explains clearly the way in which you're all familiar with houses are assessed in the AONB countryside. And so from their perspective, that in weighing up the two, given that the harm from the house is quite great, given the policy considerations in relation to AONB, although still having regard to the housing land supply position as well, it doesn't out the provision of that and its harm that is more than the benefit that would be provided by the car park. So the recommendation in this instance is for refusal.
Thank you very much, Sam. Very well explained, and I think some members will remember the site when we visited in relation to the Section 106, and we'll just have a perspective not exactly of the precise application, but certainly a perspective. So firstly, we're going to hear from Mr. Martin Hull, who's representing the applicant. So Mr. Hull, you've got 5 minutes. Don't be panicked. We're all very friendly, but do try and keep it to 5 minutes, because I really hate having to interrupt people. It's very rude, and I don't like to do it. But often that is the case. After that, members will have the opportunity to ask you questions. So anything that you haven't been able to expand on, that is an opportunity through answering questions. So I'm going to hand over to you. Please say what you'd like to say. I should just say, sorry, before you finish, after the vote is taken, I will be asking you to leave the meeting, yeah? You can continue watching on YouTube. Thank you. Could you turn your microphone on?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. I've previously circulated a letter outlining the issues in this case, but in its simplest form, it revolves around making a choice between making the journey to church a much less dangerous prospect and providing community benefits by ensuring that the long-term future of the church is maintained. On the flip side, of course, we have the effect on the countryside and whether there is any heritage effect on the church itself. The applicant lives locally and is a member of the church congregation. Good fortune means that she is able to help her community and church, and she has endeavoured to do the right thing at all times. There was a public exhibition at the church and about the proposals, and 87 parishioners supported it, which I think you'll agree is a significant number in support. A pre-application assessment was carried out, and this was attached to the letter I circulated. The pre-application was generally positive. The car park was not objected to, and the officer concluded that a detailed financial justification was required, and that this should consider any alternative funds available. This, of course, was submitted as part of the planning application, and officers have not objected to it. The development of a single dwelling is the only mechanism to deliver the new access and the car park. In my view, the health and safety of residents is a key consideration in this case, as is the ability of the church to self-fund through additional services and other community activities. The new car park and access avoids residents having to walk along a dangerous road and up a very steep footway. It will help the church hold other community events, which in turn will help its funding. There have been no accidents along this road, which is obviously something to be thankful for, but we cannot foresee any further forward than that. Heritage England, I know, have not objected to the scheme outright, but they have admitted that there is some harm, and they've countenanced that with saying it is limited in their letter. Because they didn't visit the site, they did not see the character of the area, nor the other properties that surround the church. In fact, the house known as Overdale, which is the one referred to in the presentation, is quite obvious from views from the field. And the proposed dwelling, with substantial landscaping around it, wouldn't be materially different from that. The council's conservation officer also attended the site, and I understand that she made positive comments about the scheme. In view of this, we don't really understand why the case officer places more weight on the issue of health, on the issue of heritage, than health, highway safety, and community benefits. I just wanted to draw members' attentions to the Sedlescombe neighbourhood plan, which was agreed with officers and made in April 2018 following a referendum. It contains an allocation for 8 dwellings adjacent to St John the Baptist Church. This is a Grade 2 listed building, and the purpose of the allocation is to fund a car park and fund repairs and alterations to the church. The site is also within the AONB. Given that the proposals here are for a single dwelling, and they occupy part of the downslope of the field, we are struggling to understand why the officer places more weight on the AONB impacts than health, highway safety and community benefits. Small-scale development is permissible in the AONB if it is limited in scale. This is explained at paragraph 172 of the NPPF. It is only major development that should be prevented in such locations. In our view, if the Sedlescombe site is deemed to be limited in scale and warrants an allocation, then so should this site. There's plenty of examples of land being donated and used in this way, and I think another example in Sedlescombe is the Breed Lane development for 16 houses, which involved land being transferred for public open space and the adjacent school. As you know, it's an outline application, and so the detailed design and appearance and landscaping is something that can be put together for a later date. We feel that this scheme would make a tremendous difference to the safety of churchgoers, be accessible and enhance the usability of this community building. We therefore hope members would kindly take these comments into account when making a decision. Thank you.
Do we have a connection?
Hello?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you, Chairman.
Good, thank you. I did have a moment's loss of connection there. Thank you very much. So I did lose connection for just a short period of time there. Did everyone hear Martin's full speech? Thank you very much. We hope that won't happen again. That's a good example of an internet dropout, which does take a minute or so to repair. So thank you very much for that. I'd now like to ask members if they would like to speak. Now, I did note before, I have Councillor Meir, but I did note before that Councillor Prochak had her hand up on the screen. Was that is that intended to signal me or not?
Sorry,
no?
Chairman, that was to move you as chairman.
Oh, okay. If you could take that down, that would be good. So, Councillor Meir, if you'd like to address the questions to Mr. Hull.
Yes, Mr. Hull, and I also have a question, I think, for Mr. Batchelor.
Could you ask? Just at this point, we're having questions to the representative from the applicant, so we don't sort of cross purposes, if that's okay. Yeah.
Certainly. I'd like to say, first of all, that I have visited the site. I went there yesterday and I walked around it thoroughly. I'm a little bit surprised that in all the paperwork that we've got here, pages and pages of it, we don't actually have a decent plan showing the church within its own context. And if you actually go there, or if you look at a modern map, you'll find that there are half a dozen buildings within 100 metres of this. Five of those being ordinary dwellings and one a farmhouse. The property, and I'm hoping that the speaker will confirm this, the property Leaford Oaks is only about 25 metres to the south-east of the church and has all the normal domestic paraphernalia. Could the speaker please confirm that that is the case, that this is not a church which is completely isolated in its location?
Mr. Hull, yeah, you need to speak. Put your speaker on.
Yes, Councillor, that's correct. Leaford Oaks is to the southeast. Then there is a property right on the road side in front of the church, and another one just to the northeast as well. And I think, yeah, on the site location plan that Mr. Batchelor put up, there's you can also see the ribbon development as it runs towards the railway line, and obviously the development on the opposite side of the road.
Yeah, yes, that's a little bit further
yes,
away. The 100 metres, there's Leaford Oaks, the Vineyard Grange, Mill House, Petley Lodge, Watermill Cottage, and Leaford Farmhouse.
That's correct. Yes.
Thank you.
Councillor Mary Barnes.
It's actually Councillor John Barnes.
Oh, okay. Good.
I wanted to ask the relationship. Obviously, the car park is desirable. How did the applicant come to the feeling that it had to be funded by a new dwelling house.
Yes, thank you, Councillor. As part of the submission, part of the requirement was to explain other options for funding, and in doing that exercise of identifying different grants that were available, it became clear quite soon that a number of the grant awarding bodies had thresholds which were far less than would be required for the construction purposes in this case. But the single biggest issue is because this is a private individual who isn't a charity or another organisation of that type, the criteria for making grants available doesn't apply, unfortunately. So we were left with a situation where the development proposal had to fund the community benefit that was being offered.
Good. Did you want to respond? Did you want to ask another question, John?
Yeah, I will follow up. I mean, if the private owner had given the land to the church, then the church could presumably then look for funding for the car park. I'm wondering why we're going about it entirely the development funding the car park rather than the land being given to the church.
Well, I think part of the strategic direction, if you like, is that the council's obviously supported a similar approach at Sedlescombe, and I believe the farmer who owns the field has secured the allocation. But of course, I don't think the church is has the ability to put together a planning application. They haven't got the funds to do that, and that would need to be achieved first before applying for grants. So the applicant has spent many thousands on ecology surveys, on architectural drawings and other consultants in order to put the application in. Now, if the church wanted to take that approach, they would have to have done all of that themselves before applying for grant funding, and they just haven't got the funds to even kickstart the approach.
Thank you. Councillor Coleman.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Hull, do you have a rough idea of the number of people in sort of the church's average sort of congregation of a Sunday?
Well, I don't have that information at hand, but what I can say is that at the public consultation event, there are 87 parishioners that expressed support for it, and there was one that didn't support it. And I think attendance will vary, of course, but I would imagine for a Sunday service we are looking at a congregation of around 100 people, give or take. Maybe depends on the service, of course, but it could drop down to 70. It could be as high as 100. So it's in that range.
Thank you. Councillor Thomas.
Hello, Mr. Hull. Thank you very much for that extremely lucid presentation. I thought it was a very, very good illustration. I'd like to ask you two questions. The first is, when you go from the parish hall in the direction of the church, if you went across land, you'll be crossing two footpaths. One of those goes south actually from the parish hall, so far as I can tell. Have you considered the possibility of creating a footpath to connect the existing car park with the church?
Yeah, there's a couple of issues there. The nature of a public right of way at the moment is one where we've got to cater for perhaps parishioners in wheelchairs. Some may have mobility problems. Some are fairly elderly. You may have mothers with pushchairs, and so that's, you know, the length of walk necessary and the hard surface infrastructure could be quite visually damaging. But there is, of course, no sort of land in that direction that is able to be used. Obviously, the applicant owns the field in question, and in terms of that, it makes it a much more effective location, and that's the reason for it, really.
So there, and can I just a supplementary to that? There is a lay-by, isn't there? Where I went to the church myself yesterday. There is a lay-by, isn't there, in the road with space there may be 2 cars. So if you did, you did have a wheelchair or something like that, you could unload the wheelchair quite safely from that lay-by, couldn't you?
Well, you could do, yes. I'm not quite sure where you would be going after that in the wheelchair. I mean, it strikes me as perhaps being a little dangerous. But I think, whether the car park is here or somewhere else, the funding for it would inevitably have to involve a new detached dwelling. And the approach that's been taken is that this is the most effective location for delivering that highway safety and community benefit need that is deliverable, I guess, really, in terms of the landowner.
And thank you very much. My last question is, I take the point about churchgoers, but so far as village activities are concerned, I've lived in a village, and the majority of the village activities took place in the village hall. The car park, the existing car park, is for the parish hall. What's to prevent the parish hall from being used for most of the community activities?
Well, you're quite right. There could be a community use of those buildings. I think in terms of the church, that they would be looking to expand some of their own services. And of course, I don't think they would be in support of holding services in a different building, a non-ordained building, if you like. So that's one thing. But also, I think that they're looking at maybe expanding sort of Sunday schools and teachings and prayer meetings and prayer groups, and really the environment of the church, the national religion, really suggests that it should be held in that particular church as opposed to decanted into other areas. But of course, as we've heard, the car park for the village hall is very small. There would still be an overspill parking problem, which can't be addressed unless a new car park is constructed.
Thank you.
And the only other thing I'd just add is that obviously sharing the village hall, I can foresee that there would be instances where maybe services might clash with other separate organisations that want to hire the hall, and the difficulties that would create.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Errington.
Did you call me then? Sorry, I beg your pardon.
Oh, Councillor Errington, and then you're after.
Thank you.
And then you're next.
Thank you, Mr. Hull. Just 2 questions, really. Can we just confirm that the church itself doesn't have a hall? It's the village hall and the church. The church doesn't have a hall attached to it.
That's quite right, yes.
Right, so any additional services and events, if you like, are actually going to take part in the church itself?
Exactly, yes.
Thank you. My second point is regarding the disabled parking. Looking at the comments from residents, it looks like the disabled parking at the moment is an informal arrangement based on the goodwill of one of the local residents. Would the proposal include disabled parking in the new car park, should it go ahead? And is there an incline, the way I didn't get a chance to go and see, but is there an incline from the car park up to the church, and how steep would that be? Is it viable to have disabled parking in the new car park?
Yes. Well, thank you. Very, very important questions. Yes, there would be disabled parking, and it would obviously be located at the closest point to the access path into the church. At that point, in the site, the land does slope down towards the road. So the gradients, although the topography hasn't been accurately plotted, The visual inspection is that it's very much at grade, and any minor alterations in terms of laying the footway can take into account making it accessible with a bound surface that allows wheels or people with walking sticks to motor along without fearing any trip hazards or anything like that.
Okay.
Thank you. And Councillor Lang.
Thank you.
Hello, sorry, butting in there, getting that wrong. Yes, actually, my question was largely answered by yourselves in terms of community activities within the church. But just as a little extension to that, how many people from outside the village do you think you serve within that church? How many other people use it?
Yes, I have to apologise. I don't have that data available, but from my own experience of churches, certainly in rural areas, they do cater for a slightly wider hinterland than the village itself, and I think that's fair to say. So there will be people travelling, and with any village in a rural area, travelling by car, of course. I'm sorry, I can't give you an exact figure.
No, that's
absolutely
fine.
I think the principle is, yes, there will be people from outside the village that would maybe have lived in the village before and still want to go to that same church.
And as a heritage asset, do you find you get many visitors?
Yeah, I mean, occasional visits, certainly. It's not, I suppose, a top destination locally, but no. Like any historic building, there will be interest groups that will pop along and will want to visit the church and have a look. Ramblers, for example, may stop off or whatever, just to have a look.
Righto, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lynn, and thank you very much, Mr. Hull. Your sort of active contribution has come to an end at this point. I just ask you to stay in the meeting, but mute your microphone, and while the other members discuss it, well, there'll be a vote at the end, and that's the point at which I'd ask you to leave. But I thank you very much. I think you really contributed to this. I'm going to ask the ward councillor, Vicky Cook, to speak now. I just have to scold her slightly for putting a comment in the chat. There's nothing wrong with the comment, but we are trying to restrict the chat just to indicate people who'd like to speak or if there's a problem with communication. Councillor Cook.
Thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Vicky Cook and I'm ward councillor for North Battle, Netherfield and Watlington. Officers, members of the planning committee, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak to this application, but also to urge officers to rethink their intention to refuse this application and for the planning committee to consider giving it their approval. The application is for outline planning permission for a house to be built in this pretty ribbon development of Watlington. The village straddles the C293, a very busy, winding road with a 40-mile-per-hour speed limit. But this is more than just an application for just another dwelling. Mrs. Butcher, the daughter of a minister, has followed the biblical examples of the early disciples by giving what she has to the church. In this case, a field, with the intention that the proceeds of the sale of some of this land to enable the funding of a car park on the rest. I don't believe this is an isolated case whereby a plot of land with outline permission for one or more dwellings has been sold and the profits used for a community project. And we should encourage these projects like this and celebrate the success stories. Yes, it is true that Watlington already has a car park, albeit some half a kilometre from the church, along the aforementioned narrow lane with an uneven, grassy verge, often wet, to negotiate, with pedestrians having their backs to traffic. And I know from personal experience, when leading a group of Girl Guides on a dark winter's evening, how nerve-wracking that can be. However, it is a village car park, not a church car park. And were the committee to let out the village hall, this facility would not be available to people using the church for whatever reason. Currently, permissible access has been granted for less able and more mature visitors to drive up a steep gravel drive to a small standing area. However, this generosity might not be continued were the current owner to move away, and new owners could withdraw this. I do understand that there are objections to overdevelopment, but this village has already had barns converted to holiday lets and then converted to dwellings. And currently, in this same village, there is an application to demolish a garage and replace it with a dwelling. I understand that there are objections to possible harm to the AONB, but the design consultants have mitigated this by sensitively siting the car park in the lower contours of the land, ensuring the higher ground, where visual prominence is greater, remains in the open countryside. And surely these issues will be dealt with when a detailed application is made. In a report from the Conservation and Design Officer, Ms. Zendefi comments, and I quote, "I have no objection to the proposed car park as it will have less than substantial harm on the setting of the Grade 2 listed church. But this is outweighed by the public benefit of the church being likely to be used more, and as such, having an increased likelihood of it having the finances to continue to protect the historic fabric of the building." She continues, "With regard to the proposed house, subject to design, and if it is located further toward the street so that it will not be viewed together with the church from longer views, it will not harm the setting of the church. However, in its current position, it will be seen together with the church and will result in a harmful impact on the setting of the listed church and views across the AONB. But having visited the site, I do not see from which vantage point the proposed dwelling will be seen together with the church, with the possible exception of the neighbouring property Overdale. Currently, visitors to the church tend not to be looking west across a field to a well-screened house, but south across the valley towards woodland and verdant fields. And, with all due respect, residents of the churchyard will not have their view affected. In 2010, when the church was almost destroyed by fire, villagers and church supporters united to build and restore this historic church. The idea of a car park was mooted at that time, but sadly there was insufficient funding. Church Warden Mr. Jeff Bridges and his colleagues have applied for funding, but monies are granted for the fabric of a building, not for capital projects such as these. And post-COVID, who is to say what grant monies will still be available? The only way forward is for this piece of land, which has outline design for a sensitively and environmentally designed and built single family dwelling, has a smaller footprint than its neighbour Overdale, and already has a discharged S106 granted by Rother District Council last year, knowing that the land would be used for development. The only way forward is that it be granted outline planning permission so that the land can be sold to a developer and the village provided with a car park to ensure the preservation of this historic church building. Let us stand firm against a society that looks for reasons not to do things, but to be a council who looks for reasons to do things and say yes to this application.
Thank you very much, Councillor Cook. I know Councillor Ganley has your hand up. We need to hear from Councillor Field, and then we'll hear from Councillor Ganley. Councillor Field.
Yes, thank you and good morning. I would say that I am also Councillor Cook's colleague as Ward Councillor for North Battlefield and Watlington, and I'm also Watlington's County Councillor. And I do know this site and I have been to the church there, and I'm really glad that this has come to the Planning Committee because it is a contentious application in a small but extremely lively village, residents of whom are never short to make their views known to everybody, and it's really good that it's like that. I'm here to support the Parish Council, which is the representative body of the village and which have supported this application. The concern seems to be the impact on the environment of the car park and of the house, and also of the potential disturbance to graves, which I don't think has been addressed in the report, and I'd like to hear somebody talk about that. Councillor Cook made reference to the Conservation Officer's comments to the case officer, Mark Cathcart, and she quoted extensively from that letter. The contents were referenced in the papers, but they weren't quoted, so I'm not sure how much members know what the Conservation Officer's views really are about this application. It would have been helpful because, as Councillor Cook said, she's not worried about the car park. She is worried about the orientation of the house, and I'm sure that's not an insurmountable problem. The current arrangements for parking at the church are very chaotic. The Village Hall car park is not marked out and doesn't hold very many cars if you park in such a way as to let your neighbours out before you leave. It is at some distance from the church. Any walking, as Councillor Cook said, from that car park, which isn't the church's car park, to the church involves going uphill after you've walked along a trafficked narrow lane without a footway. When there are large events at the church, and I've witnessed this myself, the lay-by is full, the Village Hall car park is full, and you need stewards in the road to maintain safety for the traffic coming past it and people getting out of their cars and trying to get to church. So this really is needed, I believe. The refusal talks about the development being outside the development boundary, but earlier in the papers it says there isn't a settlement boundary at all because of the way Watlington's developed, so that does seem to me to be rather contradicting itself. This church is the hub of the community. It does attract, as Councillor Cook said, people from outside. Watlington Singers, for example, I believe, well, I know they're led by somebody who isn't from Battle. They are excellent singers and they attract a lot of people to come and listen to them. It's used for other events too, as all churches are, and there is obviously going to be at some point conflict between car park usage if you're just relying on the Village Hall car park, because the Village Hall itself is very busy and has a full programme of events which need the car park. A couple of things I don't quite understand. Mr. Batchelor referred to this application for the house as being enabling of sorts and didn't quite explain what of sorts meant. And I'm not sure at the end of all this who will be owning the car park. I would hope it would be given to the church. If it remains in private hands, I think that could be an obstacle for the future. So I'd like some clarity. But on the whole, I do believe this is an asset to the community and really very much needed for the facilitation of church activity and for public safety when it comes to accessing the church from a busy, narrow lane.
Thank you very much, Councillor Field. Very good. And we'll hear from you both at the end of the discussion. So firstly, could I have Councillor Ganley? Could you turn your microphone on? Just before you go on, Mr. Hull, could I ask you to turn your camera off? Thank you. Councillor Ganley, could you turn your microphone on?
Yes, thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Hull, for a very clear and informative presentation. The pre-application advice that was received was largely supportive, and the proposal was amended in order to satisfy the pre-app review. Everything requested at the pre-app has now been supplied. That is why the applicant is surprised and not a little peeved that the recommendation is for refusal. The advantage of the proposal is clear. Currently, those attending functions in the church park in the Village Hall car park, very small, and have to walk along a narrow, unlit 40-mile-an-hour limit lane with no pavement at considerable risk from speeding vehicles. Alternatively, they park in the road, causing obstructions. And like Councillor Field, I passed the church when a wedding was in progress, and I can assure you it was absolute chaos. This is an outline application for access only. So the house, the position of the house is not fixed in concrete. It could possibly, the architect would tell us, but it could possibly be moved further down the slope, thus reducing its visibility. However, this is a matter for consideration later and not today. The only consideration today is for the access and, more importantly, the principle of development. I note that the Parish Council favours the project, which will interest the chairman who believes we should support parish councils. I would ask officers, finally, if I may say, I would ask officers to explain the apparent contradiction between, on the one hand, Heritage England's statement that there would be, quote, some harm, unquote, Historic England's statement that there would be, quote, less than substantial harm as set out in paragraph 196 of the NPPF. And on the other hand, paragraph 853 of the report, which states that it would cause considerable harm, unquote. Which is it? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Councillor Thomas.
Hello, Chair, and members of the public, members of the Planning Committee. I think a very strong argument has been made, very strong indeed, for not accepting the recommendation. But I would just like to say a few words in favour of accepting the recommendation. I'm very keen on churches. Wherever I go, I visit the church and often visit churches on the way. And this is a very beautiful church. And it's in a very special kind of setting. You go up quite a steep path to get to it. And there is a sense of going into another world as you go up there. And it is a place of great peace and great tranquility and has a very special kind of atmosphere. When you're actually in the churchyard, you look over to your right, and what you can see quite simply are green fields. There is a house, but it's very, very screened and it doesn't obtrude in any serious way. But once if this development does go ahead, there's no doubt that you will be able to see the car park and you will be able to see a house. You'll be able to see a very substantial house, a 4-bedroomed house. And that will make a very great difference to the setting of the church. And no, you won't be able to see the car park and the church at the same time, but you will be able to see from the church a very large house, which will very seriously disturb the very tranquil and rural setting that the church is in. So whatever different conservation people may say about the degree of disturbance, to my mind, it would be a very substantial change. And it isn't the norm for 13th century churches to be accompanied by car parks. It is absolutely normal to see a lovely old church like this in a rural setting, which is not actually the 21st century not obtruding on it. And so I think the damage to the AONB would be a substantial damage. And I think that's one of the things that we have to have very much at the forefront of our minds. Clearly, if the church does attract 100 attendees, it is possible for people to get to the church, albeit, you know, at some inconvenience, no question about it. But the road at this particular point between the village hall car park and the church is totally straight. There are good sight lines. And as I said in my earlier question, there is a small lay-by which could be used by people with particular difficulties. But I also think that there should be further exploration of other ways of achieving the same objective by, for example, trying to create a way along the side of the road. And that would obviously require the cooperation of the county council. But it occurs to me that that this is a route that should be considered. The other possibility is that there is a footpath, as I already said. This crosses another footpath, and there's no reason why a further footpath should not be explored. The country needs, and the county needs, a network of more footpaths, and this would be an ideal place, I think, to have one. And I think there are, if you like, non-obtrusive, non-polluting ways of achieving the same objective, which I think would be well worth exploring before we went down this particular road. I also think that a situation where the village hall is the centre for village activities is a perfectly normal one. I lived in Rotherfield, a village, and it was the village hall that was the centre of the village activities. And there's no reason why activities like a Sunday school, etc., shouldn't take place there. I did my own Sunday school in a village hall, so I know it can be done. So I would say that the environmental impacts are very considerable. And that there are other ways of actually achieving the same objective without building a large and obtrusive house and a large and obtrusive car park. And so I think on those grounds, I think that the recommendation of the officers on balance is the right one, and that the need to preserve the AONB and the particular setting of this wonderful historic church, for me, takes priority over the other considerations when I feel those other objectives could be achieved in other ways. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Thomas. Councillor Coleman.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I have a lot of track with what Councillor Thomas has just said. I think he made a very good argument there. Also, I mean, looking at the Church of England's statistics as of October 2019, their statistics show that over the last decade there's been a 15% drop in the average congregation numbers. In fact, the typical congregation is about 27 worshippers. Obviously, it's interesting to hear Mr. Hull's estimate of up to 100, and that sounds very positive. But nonetheless, over the last decade, church marriages have fallen by a third. Fewer than 1 in 10 babies are baptised. So, as a council, when we're looking at this application for this outline planning application for what will be a car park, can we justify the need for spaces for basically an expansion when the Church of England's own statistics show, in fact, that churches are not expanding and that their numbers are declining? And that's notwithstanding the fact that this development is contrary to policies OSS2, OSS3, OSS4, RA2, RA3, EN1, TR3 of the local plan core strategy, policies DIM2, policies DEN1 and DEN2 of the DASA, and paragraphs 170, 78, 103, 172, 190, 193, 194 and 196 of the National Planning Policy Framework. So I think that's what it says in the report. So I think personally I'm struggling to see the argument for this development, especially since Councillor Thomas made his argument as well, which I think has added to my concerns about this.
Thank you very much, Councillor Coleman, and you have impressed us with your reading. It's wonderful to see. Councillor Barnes, and I'm not sure if that's John Barnes we're hearing from.
Yes, I listened. I know this village. In fact, I was until recently briefly its district council representative before the boundary shifted and it went Councillors Field and Councillor Cook. And I know the church and I know the overall setting. I think I'm in two minds, to be honest. The case for the car park is obviously quite a good one. It may be that Councillor Thomas is right and it could be achieved in some other way. But what troubles me is that we are going to alter the setting of a medieval church without any detail of how that setting is going to be altered. I am troubled by the fact that this is an outline application only about the access. When you're dealing with the setting of a building as historic as this in the OMB, I think you really require some detail of what is actually going to happen. And at the moment, we have no detail on the car parking. We have no detail at all on the house. And our own conservation officer has said that the placing of the house would be vital in terms of looking at the setting of the church. I would be more inclined, I think, to reject at the moment, not because I'm out of sympathy with what the village wants to achieve and the parish council wants to achieve, which is car parking for the church. I think that is desirable. But I would like to know a lot more about the means and the way you're going to alter the setting. And on an outline, frankly, we haven't got that detail. So that inclines me at the moment to go against, to go with the officers and against the applicant.
Thank you very much, Councillor Barnes. Councillor Ganley, you indicated.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I wondered if you would ask officers to answer the question I put to them in my short presentation. If you like, I can repeat it.
Please do.
I would ask officers to explain the apparent contradiction between, on the one hand, Heritage England's statement that there would be, quote, some harm, unquote. Historic England's statement that, quote, there would be less than substantial harm, as set out in paragraph 196 of the NPPF, unquote. And on the other hand, paragraph 853 of the report, which states that it, quote, would cause considerable harm, unquote. Which is it?
Mr. Batchelor.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Ganley, for your questions. I did make a note of them as well, so I was ready to come back and answer those queries. I'm paying attention.
You may want to ask any others that you felt need answering at the same time.
At this point?
Well, yeah, answer Councillor Ganley. If you've seen any
Councillor Ganley's first. So, yeah, just to explain that aspect of it, then. Well, paragraph 8.5.3 is actually in the section of the report that's dealing with the landscape impact and the impact on local character. And I think the officer's just trying to convey that from their perspective that the harm, particularly in relation to the dwelling at least, would be significant in terms of its impact on landscape character. So I wouldn't then relate that to the comments from from Historic England. In fact, actually, the better paragraphs to make reference to in that respect are probably paragraphs 8.6.4 and 8.6.5. In fact, all the paragraphs in that subsection are about the impact on the setting of the listed building. But just to summarise, they include the comments that you quoted yourself from Historic England about their conclusion that the proposal was less than substantial harm. But it's at 8.6.5, I believe, where the officer goes on to conclude that from their perspective that they also agree that the scheme, again, mostly really in respect of the dwelling house, but nonetheless still taking into account the car park, would result in less than substantial harm. So from a decision-making point of view, in terms of impact on heritage, you're then using that paragraph from the NPPF to weigh up the benefits of the scheme in terms of that level of harm to the heritage asset, which, to be clear, isn't a significant high level of harm, but nonetheless is still considered to be a scheme that causes some harm, and therefore you're just having a balancing exercise to be had.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And sorry, Chair, just to clarify, do you want to go back over some of those points?
Please do.
Just a couple, although the debate, I think, has covered quite a lot of this. But one of the first things that was raised was about the Sedlescombe neighbourhood plan and the possible comparisons with that. If anything, I would just advise you that that's, in this instance, from my perspective, relatively limited weight should be given to that kind of comparison. The difference being that the site in Sedlescombe has gone through a neighbourhood plan process and it's now an allocation. So whether or not officer kind of concerns about AONB impact, landscape impact on setting of a heritage asset are not comparable in this instance, because actually the starting point for any proposal in that area is that it would very likely comply with policy, and that's gone through a due process, and the local community have voted in favour of that. Here we don't have that policy, and we're just using current policies which you're aware of in terms of a house, try to control and restrict development in the countryside, and also having regard to those landscape policies and also those policies about heritage. So they're not immediately comparable in this instance. I think maybe one of the things that probably was worth explaining was the point that Councillor Field raised about the comments about enabling development. I said it was enabling development of sorts, and just to clarify that, it's because there's actually an official type of enabling development, and in the NPPF that's covered in the heritage section, and in that respect, it's an opportunity when there's a development that, where there's a heritage asset that's at risk, or there's some concern about its optimal viable use, such that a development that maybe would usually be inappropriate, that would help protect that heritage asset, should be considered and possibly allowed, and that is called enabling development. But we come across enabling arguments otherwise infrequently, but every now and then in planning terms, and this is one of those instances. So this is just a different type of enabling development. It's not the official enabling development that Historic England have published guidance about and that's referenced in the NPPF, but nonetheless it's still an argument put forward in this application that the applicant is asking you to give material weight to, which is that from their point of view, the church would benefit the car park would benefit the church and provide those highway safety impacts, but at the expense of providing that dwelling in the countryside. So that's what I meant in that instance. And I don't think necessarily there was anything that I wanted to come back on, other than to say that in terms of the conservation officer's comments, you'll appreciate that actually the conservation officer is an integral member of the planning team. So they're not a consultee in the same way that Historic England is, or the Highway Department are, or maybe even another separate body within the council is. And so the report that we provide to you is a case officer, but nonetheless team view about that proposal. And so, yeah, there may well be comments that the conservation officer may make, or the policy team may make, or I might suggest to the case officer at the time. But what is presented to you in terms of a heritage argument is as in the report, and not as necessarily taking into account the conservation officer's kind of isolated view.
Thank you, Sam. Appreciate that. I have to raise a question with you, Sam. I think technically the church site in Settlescombe is not an allocated site, but a site which is supported, even though it shows an allocated site. I might be technically right or wrong there, but that's perhaps a discussion for another day. Could we have Councillor Meir, please?
Thank you, Chair. I think that if this were just an application for the car park, I don't think we'd be having much trouble. The house is what causes the problems here. As far as I can see, looking at the policies, this is a dwelling in the countryside, in the sense of there being no development boundary outside a development boundary, and it doesn't seem to fall within any of the exceptions to that rule, the rule that we would tend to look without favour on such an application. It's not, strictly speaking, enabling development. It seems to fall through all the cracks, despite having many benefits for the church, for the community, for the heritage, in the sense of being a living institution rather than just stones. And a question I would have, first of all, for Sam Batchelor in a moment, is whether paragraph 192 of the National Planning Policy Framework document assists the applicant in any way, because that would allow us as a planning authority to look at the desirability of sustaining and enhancing the significance of heritage assets and putting them to viable uses consistent with their conservation. And also, we can take account of the positive contribution that conservation of heritage assets can make to sustainable communities, including their economic viability. I wonder if that might be a little crack that would help the applicant in this case. Just moving on slightly, I do take Councillor John Barnes' point about this being an outline application. It is very difficult to assess what this is going to look like because we simply don't know. We've not been told. The applicant has very helpfully marked out a proposed place where the house might go, but beyond that, we know nothing. I think that objection really applies to all outline applications, whether it's for 160 houses or one. We really don't know what we're letting ourselves in for. And I would say, if councillors were minded to grant this application, I think the applicant would have to understand that what came forward subsequently was a really, really very high standard, very good, very well thought out dwelling. And my last point is that in terms of the view from the churchyard over towards where the house is proposed, you see the surroundings of Overdale, the nearest house, Overdale. And that is surrounded by, you can't see Overdale really, except in the winter, we saw in the photograph. It is surrounded by trees which are non-native species or not native to the Weald. And I think that, you know, in another context, people might well be objecting to that in itself. So is it such a great view? Would a high quality house detract from it? I don't really think so. And against that, we've got the principle that we would be, unless Sam Batchelor can help us, we are going against our own policies. Can Mr. Chairman?
Would you like Sam to respond to that? Sam?
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Mears, sorry, I might need you just to explain the going against our own policies bit in a bit more detail. I didn't quite get that, but the bit that I did pick up first of all was your reference to paragraph 192.
Well, can I explain about our own policies?
Please.
Well, our own policies would seem to be, this is area of outstanding natural beauty. It is outside any development boundary, and to help Councillor Field, there isn't a development boundary, so therefore it's outside a development boundary. It's outside a development boundary. It's not a replacement dwelling. It doesn't fall with any of the couple of other exceptions of that sort. So it would be against our policies to allow a dwelling in the countryside here. And I know that we have done it in another case where there was no community benefit at all, but I voted against that. So that's why I'm seeking your help to see if paragraph 192 assists me.
Okay, sorry. Just from the way that you was explaining it previously, I thought that you meant there was some kind of contradiction there, but I think I understand where you're coming from now, so thank you. I mean, to a certain degree, yes, paragraph 192 would assist, but you can't take that paragraph in isolation. So essentially, when what that paragraph is saying is that when you're deciding an application that involves a heritage asset of sorts, that you just need to take into account whether or not that scheme helps with the kind of general purpose of trying to sustain and enhance heritage assets, or in old terminology, protect or enhance. And really, if anything, if you were to expand on what it is that paragraph 192 is getting at, well, in this instance, you're talking about a scheme that has quite openly said it's one development, which is the house, to enable the facilitation of another development, the car park, in order to then benefit the church. So then you're talking about the enabling that the applicant has put forward. But the report then goes on to make quite clear that the official enabling references in the NPPF and in accordance with Historic England's guidance don't apply here. And I believe the applicant has also said as much in their own planning statement. So that would be paragraph 202, I think, which explains about the enabling development in terms of heritage. So you are just then looking at the scheme and whether or not you agree that there is a material argument to be made about enabling with a small e, I suppose, and whether or not the fact that we have other policy considerations like the ones that you just mentioned, are the benefits that the applicant is putting forward here outweighing those. So sorry, it's not a black and white answer for you, because I don't think you can take 192 in isolation, but that is just generally saying that you do have to seek in your determination the kind of positive, the benefits that an application may have in terms of the sustaining and enhancing a heritage asset that might be subject to an application.
Are you happy with that? You need your microphone on. Yep.
I was only going to say, and that conservation includes uses, not just stones. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much. Councillor Prochak.
Thank you, Chairman. I think the length and complexity of this debate probably reflects that we've just had 6 hours training on planning. And so it's very good when we have councillors saying policy, policy, policy. Thank you, Councillor Coleman. It is an extraordinarily lovely church, and Mr. Hull and certainly Councillor Cook made very, very clear what they want here to enhance their beautiful, beautiful church. Their church, in fact, I've had a letter from 2 residents in Robertsbridge who go to that church pleading the case for this application. So yes, people do go from outside Watlington. I'm sure the envy of many churches to get 100 people there. If I think about churches across Rother, they all have this problem in some way or other. When I think about, well, perhaps not Etchingham, I don't know, but when you think about Salehurst Church, which is a very, very large church here for Robertsbridge and Salehurst, and every time there's an event, it's chaos. And we manage, but there's absolutely no way we could get a car park up here. So it's a narrow road, windy road, definitely. I have been to the church. We did a site visit last year, earlier, and I actually went to a funeral of Richard Moore, he's a internationally known figure. So a very, very busy funeral. And what we did there was we parked in a field beyond the church, the village hall car park, which, as you said, is quite small. So I think what Councillor Meir is saying is that if it was just for the car park, we might be able to support it, because they've made the case so well about how this would be used and needed. However, it's the enabling aspect that is, the policies go against it. In fact, they could build a multi-storey car park if you have a house there, if that was the enabling factor. And so I think this is what is making us think this should not be approved. And I move the recommendation.
All right, thank you for moving that. We've got a few more people who'd like to speak before we look for a seconder on that. Councillor Harmer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A fascinating debate, actually, and some very strong cases on both sides. For me, I think what's important is, in terms of the environment, it seems to me more about a view rather than damage. But for me, what stands out is it's about the community. And both ward councillors obviously know their area and their patch very well. And I just tend to sway that way in terms of supporting what is obviously a very active church and an active village, and listening to how it really happens, how it really works. So, yeah, I think I will probably support the ward councillors who know how life is really going on there. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Councillor Errington.
Thank you. Just really question to Sam Batchelor, please. On paragraph 8.2.3, the proposal for the dwelling is not for agricultural, economic or tourist needs. If the proposal had been, say, for a micro hotel or some office premises, would it have been viewed differently? I know that's not quite what the argument is at the moment, but would we be looking at that differently if it fell into any of those 3 categories? Obviously, we don't know at the moment because it's only outlined, and they could come back with a 4-bedroom house that has 2 ensuite bedrooms, and they're going to make it a B&B, which would cover the tourism need.
I think the main, sorry, Chair, is that okay to answer the question?
Yeah, please, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. I think the main thing is that, yes, it's not something you would necessarily be considering at this point in terms of, like, the alternatives of what there possibly could be. I mean, the fact that you've mentioned them, though, might be something that would then plant a seed in the applicant's mind for them to consider. But again, whether or not that would be acceptable, I think they should have discussions with us about that. But just to answer briefly, yes, you would be looking at it differently in so much as some of those other uses do have policy support. So you might not even actually be looking at that as an enabling development, because it would just be acceptable in its own merits, potentially, if it was one for another use. But that's not what's proposed in this instance, and maybe quite rightly, because they might not be as beneficial. You're not necessarily going to get as much money for an office unit that would support rural tourism as you would do for a dwelling. So I'm sure there's some factors there, but yes, some uses are supported in rural areas.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're good with that. Councillor Barnes. We've got Mary Barnes.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. What an absolutely fascinating exchange of views. And I have to say, when I was thinking to myself, what would I consider would be suitable to build there? Well, an annex to the church, for example, has been done in some of our rural areas. But with very great regret, I really think that although I feel every sympathy with the church and its problems, really this is one policy we really can't go against. And I'm afraid that I'm going to have to, having listened, and I really did go into this with a totally open mind, and I've listened very carefully to what everyone's saying. And I'm quite capable of voting against a proposal offered by the officers, but I have to say on this one, I can't support it. So can I second Councillor Procek's proposal, please?
You can, and but there are a couple of people who still want to speak. So we have a mover and a seconder, and I'm going to ask Councillor Langlands to speak.
Hello, yes, I must admit I'm struggling with the fact that many of our churches today are not being used, and we're in a situation where we're actually losing heritage assets because they can't afford to maintain them and so on and so forth. This church seems to be one where people are trying to find new ways to keep that heritage asset going, to be able to maintain it on their own and be able to bring in people from the surrounding areas to use it and enjoy it. So that's part of my struggle. But Sam, going back to you, with the 192 enabling section of the PPF, what about using 79 rural housing point B? The development would represent the optimal viable use of a heritage asset, or would be appropriate enabling development to secure the future of a heritage asset. Could we not look at that and say, well, that actually is really what this is all about?
Yes, thank you, Councillor Langlands. Chair, is it okay to talk about that again?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah, I think actually that's tied up with the advice that I gave earlier. That paragraph of the NPPF is kind of interrelated with then paragraph 202. So it's like a double reference. So it's talking about those instances in which you'd be using like enabling development with a capital E, you know, the former enabling development argument in order to protect a heritage asset. Because that terminology, optimum viable use, heritage asset, that's all related to heritage arguments that are explained a little bit more in chapter 16, which is the conservation section of the NPPF. And I suppose the only thing I can say in that respect is the officer's report, and as I understand it, the information provided by the applicant in this instance as well in their planning statement, is they're not putting forward an enabling development argument to you in terms of heritage. That's not what they're doing, because I don't think there's any information in the application to say that in terms of heritage that the building is struggling. It was refurbished a few years ago following some fire damage and an insurance payout that helped deal with that, and it's actively in use at the moment. But what they have put forward to you is that there will be highway safety and community benefits. So I think that if anything, I would say that you have to set aside the enabling heritage argument, although you may still have an opinion about how strongly you feel that relates in this instance, but that's not the arguments that have been put forward. And this is just enabling again with the small e, just to say, look, we think that actually long term there would be some benefits to the church here if we had this facility, and that's the argument that they put forward. So I don't think that paragraph or the other ones that I mentioned previously about the heritage enabling development argument apply in this instance, or carry much weight anyway, at least.
Okay.
Right, thank you. Just before we move on, Councillor Courtell, I see you put your name up to speak. We've had a very long debate on this, and you're not a substitute. I know you've been at the meeting, and I think you even came to the training, but it's really important that we keep this to the ward councillors and to the committee, because we have had a very long debate. So I hope I don't upset you by saying that I'm not going to actually have any more speakers. I think we've had a very long debate on this, and I think we're probably even due for a break. So my apologies on that one. if a non-member or non-ward member wants to speak, it really is advisable to say so before the meeting, so we can accommodate if possible. So this has been a really interesting debate. I know we have a mover and a seconder, and I just want to sort of wrap up a few points on it. With what I'm really pleased to hear is this discussion on enabling development, and there were some references to the Settlescombe Neighbourhood Plan, which, as you all know, very much sits in my heart. It's a slightly different situation because there the church owns the land, and their intention is to, as much as they can, do the development. So they will reap the profits from that development, and they will have ownership of the car park and so forth. But there's a lot of an enormous amount of detail that has to go into justifying that sort of development, because you really need to show exactly the profit that's coming out of it, and show that profit will be 100% focused in on whatever the issue is in the church, and they have a car park and renovations. Personally, I felt very strongly about saying yes to this, but as the debate's gone on, I think I've sort of I've ebbed and waned a bit on it. Impact on the A&B is not all about views. It's about a slow creep. We have seen some individual houses developed in the A&B, and I can't say that I feel positive about any of those approvals. Some of them have been delegated. But on the other hand, and the point is, this is an outline application, and that's very frustrating. As the debate went on, I started to think, well, a car park doesn't have to be a tarmac surface. It can be the surface that grass grows through. It can be quite a green car park, so you can have quite a sensitive car park. That's something for a complete application. The house can be in a different position. It does concern me that the profit will come just out of the land and not out of the house. And this is where the two parts of the enabling development aren't connected together. And that does present an issue for me. It allows the developer to make a nice handsome profit regardless of what was paid for the land. And the fact that somebody is prepared to give this land is just fantastic. And parking at churches in the countryside is a major problem, particularly as there are quite a lot of older residents. And I know in Settlescombe on the B2244, it is a nightmare. And I know the Watlington Road, I drive up it all the time, and it is a very dangerous road around that area. So I personally have a lot of sympathy for precisely what the applicant is doing. Would a barn be approved on that site right next to a church? Probably not, because it's right next to the church. And I think Councillor Barnes made a very good point about the setting of that church. But when these churches were built, people walked to church. They didn't drive a car. Nowadays they can't walk because they'll probably be knocked over by a car. And it is a real challenge. So I think we've heard some really strong arguments on both sides for this. I sense that people would like to help the church, but it's just not quite tied together. It seems to be the question at hand. And where you have such a beautiful asset, do we want to impact that asset permanently by a non-natural, complementary house and car park, particularly when it is not pure enabling development? And I am the single largest supporter of that. In fact, I can tell you in the neighbourhood plan, the three things that really helped that plan was the fact that we could say to the community, look, you're going to have some housing, it's going to be in these sites, and a lot of people don't like those sites, but on the other side of the equation, this plan will support parking at the church, which got enormous support. It'll support the redevelopment of an industrial site and something to do with improving the Pestalozzi charity. Yeah, and that was a charitable thing, not a commercial thing. So that was really important, and that really helped the community come to that decision. But as Sam pointed out, that was done through referendum, and people could have voted against that and said that was a bad idea, and they didn't want that regardless. So that's where we have it, and we are now at the point of a vote. There has been a move to support the recommendation by Councillor Prochak, and that has been seconded by Councillor Barnes, and I'm going to ask Clerk Julie Hollands to take a vote.
Okay, members, I will call your name out in alphabetical order. You need to say for, against or abstain. Councillor John Barnes.
Support the motion.
Councillor Mrs Barnes.
Support.
Councillor Coleman.
For the recommendation.
Councillor Curtis.
For.
Councillor Errington.
For.
Councillor Ganley.
For the recommendation.
Councillor Hart.
Against.
Councillor Langland.
Against.
Councillor Madeley.
For.
Councillor Mear.
With great sadness, support the recommendation.
Councillor Prochak.
For.
Councillor Stevens.
For.
Councillor Thomas.
For.
And Councillor Vinehall.
Yes, I also say regrettably for. My heart is in the opposite direction, but I would like to see something else come back.
That's 12 for and 2 against.
So the recommendation is held. Thank you very much. And I think on that note, because that took a long time, it was a very good debate. I think we can all feel very good about the fact that we've taken quite a lot out of the training that we had this week. Should we have a 5-minute break? Yeah.
Yes,
so,
please.
Yes, please.
So that would bring us back at. Well, it's going to be a couple of minutes more. Let's come back at 11:15. So it'll be a little bit more than a 5-minute break. Julie, could you put up the appropriate slide? Thank you very much. We are recommencing the Planning Committee meeting, and the next item is item 10 on the agenda, which is application RR 2020/865/P, which is land at Hurst Green, Pooks Farm, London Road. If I could ask Sam Batchelor to speak on that.
Chairman.
Can we reiterate our personal and prejudicial interest in this?
Thank you very much. I appreciate you doing that. And I think you have to leave the meeting.
We have to leave the room.
You need to leave. I think, Julie, could you just give the correct instructions on that?
Yes, councillors, if you'd just like to leave the meeting, so press your red button, and then that item has been agreed and completed, I will reconnect you back into the meeting again.
Okay, doing that now.
Good, thank you very much. Mr. Batchelor.
Thank you, Chair. So just bear with me whilst I turn on the screen sharing again. So I believe you should see the first slide. So a simpler application this time round. We have an extension to an existing house that was granted planning permission in 2015. That application was an annex, and as is common with annex applications, there were conditions on that restricting it to its ancillary annex use. The applicant would like a more flexible use now, so as well as using it as an annex when the occasion arose, they would also like to use it as a holiday let, so they've applied to vary the condition that currently restricts the use of the extension. This is the application site that we're talking about. It's a property with quite a large holding, but what we're actually referring to is the building that's over here. Turn the laser pointer off. This is the property as it was approved in 2015. This is it as built. And there's another photograph there just showing, well, the entrance and also a nice little dog there for you. So the application recommendation is for approval such that the condition should be varied to allow the additional holiday let use as well. And that's actually supported by planning policies in principle, which support rural tourism as a means of kind of supporting the rural economy. So recommendation for approval. Thank you, Chair.
All right, just before we continue, Councillor Errington, can you see the plans now? Or could you see them?
Oh, sorry, I can turn them back on if you like.
Councillor Errington, did you see them?
No, I didn't. Can I have a quick look? Thank you.
Yes.
Councillor Aington, can you see them now?
No, it must be me. Don't worry, I've got the papers in front of me.
Okay. Unlike the other applications, you're not being asked to approve any additions or anything in this instance. So they're just an aid, really. So there isn't anything that you need to see necessarily. So hopefully you should be fine from the report.
All right. We don't have any ward councillors wishing. Well, actually, I think the ward councillor is actually the applicant, isn't it, in this case? So not speaking. I haven't got anyone asked to speak. Did anyone want to ask questions about this? No. Did anyone want to propose the recommendation?
I move approval, Chairman. Councillor Curtis.
All right. We have Councillor. Your moved. Councillor Prochak has also. Councillor Prochak, could you confirm you could be a seconder?
Second.
Okay. Thank you very much. So on that basis, I think we're going to go straight to a vote. We have a mover, which is Councillor Curtis, and a seconder, Councillor Prochak. Julie Holland, could you please take a vote?
Okay, members, I'll call your names out in alphabetical order. You need to say for, against, or abstain. So Councillor Coleman.
For.
Councillor Curtis.
For.
Councillor Errington.
For.
Councillor Ganley.
For.
Councillor Harmer.
For.
Councillor Langlands.
For.
Councillor Madeley.
For.
Councillor Mear.
For.
Councillor Prochak.
For.
Councillor Stevens.
For.
Councillor Thomas.
For.
And Councillor Vinehall.
For.
That's unanimous.
Thank you very much. Recommendation is upheld. That takes us on to item 11. Now, item 11 is the quarterly
Chair, I'm just going to
statistics.
call back in councillors, the two councillor
Oh.
Barnes. If you could just hold fire
Thank
a
you very
moment.
much. Yes, we mustn't leave anyone outside the meeting. It's very easy to do, unfortunately.
Okay, they're both back into the meeting now.
Good. We have you, Councillor Barnes. Councillor Barnes, can we just confirm that you are able to hear us?
Yes, indeed. We're both here.
Oh, good. Thank you very much. Thank you for that. We're moving on to item 11, which is the planning statistics for the quarter. Tim Pickling is going to present these. Can I just say a thank you to Tim and Christine Hisker, who does the actual stats, for making some really good improvements to the report. As I think you've probably seen, they're now presented also as some trend reports, so we can see how the statistics are moving over the last 4 quarters. You know, this is being done at a time when, like all the officers, have had to work in more difficult circumstances and so forth. So adding something like this on top is just another thing that they have to fit in. And thank you very much, both Tim and Christina, for doing this. So Tim, if you could take over.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just very briefly, as Chair's indicated, this is your quarterly stats report on workload and performance in development management. So it covers the number of planning applications we receive, the number of appeals we deal with, and enforcement complaints. What's slightly different this time, as Chair's alluded, is the fact that we've now got some trend reports as well on the previous 3 quarters. So you have a bigger picture, if you like, of performance and workload throughout the development management function of the planning service. And the update report also includes 2 additional trend reports, which you've been sent to yesterday on the planning applications and the planning enforcement. It's for your noting, but if you have any specific questions, I'm happy to take them. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So over to members. We have Councillor Tempe.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just was curious about the total number of complaints. Sorry, excuse me. For the total number of complaints, and I wondered whether whether they could be explained a little bit better in that, are they actually more than a year old? And also, you know, like, have they been on stream for quite a long time? You did explain to me, because I did raise this question with you prior to the meeting, you did explain that you like to keep complaints to a reasonable 200, and I'm not sure where that figure comes from, whether that's a general figure. But it would be better to know, one, whether they're minor or major complaints, which I think you said to me that that's how you delineate them, and also how old they are, perhaps, might be useful. Thank you very much, and sorry about the barking.
I guess enforcement complaints are a little bit more difficult to put in categories of time as you would with a planning application, because the sheer nature of planning enforcement covers a multitude of different potential breaches of planning control, and also includes what essentially are neighbour disputes. So when a complaint is received, and as you know, we receive them electronically, and there's quite a rigorous form that complainants need to submit, and that's not to try and make it difficult to complain, because that information is then used as a part of a triage approach, and every week myself and Sam meet with the enforcement team, and we go through all the new complaints or any changes in the status of current enforcement complaints, and we assess whether they are complaints that are essentially breaches of planning control, whether they are something that can be dealt with by a retrospective application, whether it needs further investigation, which may involve the complainant being involved in terms of monitoring sites, etc. So the number of complaints we get, that active number that we have reported under 5.0 of 324 is the current live total. Now, the total that our capacity effectively is 200. So you can see by that number, we're over capacity, if you like, in terms of current workload and planning enforcement. And I have to say, in the whole time I've been here, planning enforcement tends to have an enormous amount of workload that we have to look at, and that's why we have the triage approach, by which we look at the first instance, a desktop approach, if you like, to try and assess whether a number of those issues aren't indeed worth making formal complaints, because they're indeed not within the confines of the planning system and their neighbour complaints. But then obviously a number of those then come forward as retrospective applications. Some of them are not what we call expedient to take any action. They're minor breaches, or the ones that are deemed to be inappropriate, then we take formal action. And the formal action usually ends up being an enforcement notice or a 215 notice if it's an untidy site, for example. And then if the enforcement notice is not complied with, then we will then prosecute, and it goes to the courts. And I think, roughly speaking, about 25-30 cases per annum go to the enforcement notice level, and then probably up to 15 go to prosecution. So it's a filtration process by which you go down. So I'm not quite sure if that answers your question, Councillor Tempe, but I'm trying to give you an overview of how we operate and function.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I just feel that anyone who doesn't understand the pressures that you're under might look at that and think, oh, that's horrific. But I think you've explained it very well. But it is quite worrying that if you look at the other trend of complaints received, that it's actually quite high, isn't it? And I'm sure that's to do with your staffing issues and having to resolve things, you know, with not as many people as you need. But thank you very much for that.
Okay.
Thank you. Councillor Cortell, I feel obliged to ask you to speak, having not allowed you to speak before. Councillor Cortell.
Thank you, Chair. My question was also about the volume of enforcement complaints. the number of complaints resolved, according to page 28 of our papers, was 124 over the past year, if you add the 4 quarters together. I noticed, Mr. Hickling, that you've just indicated that there's a capacity of 200, but in practice, 124 appear to have been resolved over the past year. Taking the ratio between the number of complaints in hand, which is 324, and the number of complaints resolved of 124, there seems to be a backlog of over 2.5 years worth of complaints. Now, I appreciate you have a triage system and that you identify the most urgent complaints first, and you address different complaints in different ways. But I think for someone who doesn't make it through the triage, the frustration of waiting a couple of years or more must be immense. And I wondered whether you had a plan to increase capacity in that area.
It's more about being more efficient. I think in terms of increasing capacity, I don't think that is an option for us. We have 3 enforcement officers, and the district is divided into 3 portions, if you like. They are also supported by Sam and myself, and they're also supported by the DM case officers as well, because some of the enforcement cases directly relate to planning permissions, for example, breaches of condition, etc., where the case officers themselves have better knowledge of dealing with those particular sites and what the actual issues are. So whilst we have a dedicated team of 3, the reality is most of the DM staff do touch on enforcement in one shape or another. The reality, the number of complaints that take longer, up to 2 years, as you say, is a fraction of the amount of complaints that we deal with. And those are largely because they go through the enforcement notice approach. Because when you serve an enforcement notice, of course, like with a planning application, that individual has the ability to lodge an appeal. And they can lodge an appeal on several different grounds. And that can take quite a long time. As you know, the PINs, the inspectorate are up to their eyeballs with appeals, and for whatever reason, enforcement seems to fall off that edge of that priority in terms of the PINs' workload. But once that goes through, you could be talking 2 or 3 years down the line. And then again, if it's not resolved then we'll be open to do a prosecution. So there are some complaints that we are dealing with which have been in the system for 2, 3, 4 years because they go through this process. But largely, most enforcement complaints are resolved within the first 2 or 3 months.
Thank you. Councillor Coleman.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. First of all, I just wanted to say that I think Tim and both the enforcement team and all the other planning staff do an absolutely stellar job. And we're very lucky to have our planning team. I wanted to just comment on the appeals graph there, and how pleased I am to see that the number of appeals that are dismissed seem to be going up linearly, and the number of appeals allowed seem to be going down linearly, which would suggest that the decisions of us as a planning authority are in some way improving. Whether that's just a sort of microcosm and it's not a trend, I don't know, but it certainly looks positive to me.
Thank you for your observation. Councillor Langlands.
Yeah, hello. I just wanted to ask a question with regards to the minor applications that are decided within an agreed time frame. Obviously, I see that the major ones were actually in the 4th quarter really brilliant, 100%. All I really want to know, I see that the 4th quarter of the minor ones were sort of below 75%. How does that impact on the decisions? How, you know, if you have not decided an application in the time frame? What implications is that for the planning authority?
Well, these figures that you have in front of you are sent to the Ministry for Housing and Local Communities and Local Government in terms of our quarterly returns. And ultimately, there is a league table of local authorities in terms of their performance. And historically, as well as now, we have been assessed on 3 key targets, which is the performance of 8 weeks on others, minors, and 13 weeks on major applications. And that's been around for a number of years. And that information, we are benchmarked against other authorities who are a similar authority in terms of our makeup. But there are league tables. So you can be named and shamed if your performance goes down a certain level. And that goes in terms of your major applications, particularly with housing sites and appeals nowadays. And the ultimate sanction for government is to put local authorities into standards. In other words, they take those functions away from you. That is very, very rarely implemented by central government, but it is a stick, if you like, to make sure that we maintain our standards of process timing. And of course, with applications now, we can do what is called an extension of time, which we do with all applications as best we can, where the application's coming up to the end of the 8 or 13 week period. We ask the applicant if they agree for an extension of time for whatever reason. For example, it might go over the 8 week period because the next available planning committee is outside that 8 week period, for example, and we would require an extension of time to be able to deal with that. But of course, not all applicants want to allow us to have that extension of time. And that's why our performance isn't 100% on those categories. I don't know if Sam has anything he wants to add to that.
Yeah, I'll just add there's a per application impact as well. So Tim quite rightly mentioned that we're league tabled against other authorities, and that's used for naming and shaming, but also ultimately could mean that we go into special measures. But per application, if it's out of time, then an applicant then has appeal rights. So you don't actually have to determine an application in order for them to be able to appeal it. If the application becomes out of time, they can appeal against non-determination as well. So that's as if you've decided to refuse the application even though you haven't done it yet, and the applicant just appeals on that basis. So there's a risk of that too with applications that are outside of time.
So that effectively could cost money by just not completing it in the time frame.
Indeed, yeah. I mean, there's costs there, I suppose. From different angles, you've got the cost of actually having to process and deal with the appeal. So there's an administrative and officer cost there. But then when you're in the appeal process, because there are costs that could be applied as part of the decision making, and one of those things, one of the reasons you can apply for costs is whether or not the council has acted reasonably and timely. Then you could there's a risk of cost that way as well, which is why what Tim mentioned in terms of extensions of time is something that is kind of at the forefront of all officers' minds, because it's a benefit to the council to make sure that our applications are in time, but also it's good for our kind of relationship with applicants to know that they're in dialogue with a case officer. They understand that they're working to a certain time scale, even if it's a longer time scale, and so there should be benefits from both sides. But like Tim mentioned, not everyone's willing to agree to it every time.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. John Barnes, Councillor John Barnes.
Thank you, Chairman. I have a question and a comment. I think in terms of the league table, although I wouldn't want it at every committee, I just wonder if we shouldn't actually see it about once a year to see where we actually sit in relation to other authorities. On planning enforcement, I'm well aware that what tends to happen is you suddenly get a planning application which puts enforcement on hold. I wonder whether it would be possible to report the number of enforcement actions that have been stayed because a planning application has been put in. I think it would be quite an interesting insight into the behaviour of some of our worst I'm not sure I'll call them criminals, but people who behave badly.
Well, certainly we can give you a list of all the retrospective applications that we've received as a result of enforcement work. Yes, that's not a problem.
I think it would be illuminating for the members of the planning committee, because I'm well aware of at least two, one in my county council area, one in my district council area, where in effect the original planning application was deficient, but while they were putting certain things right, they used a planning application to do that. And there was another where we just get endless appeal after appeal after appeal every time we take enforcement, and we're on about 7th or 8th, and it's no wonder it's taking time. And there are some people who come very close to being vexatious in terms of their approach to planning.
Thank you. Tim, I wonder, so John has suggested that we might have a look at that and also perhaps at some point have a look at where we sit in the various league tables. I know that these things are produced, sort of quite constantly. When would be a time that might be able to be fitted into your department's schedule to have a look at that?
Well, it could be as easy as going on to the Ministry of Housing's website and extrapolating that information from our family group. And in which case, if it's as simple as that, we could report to the next committee.
Well, if it is as simple as that, that would be good. If it's not, then you could let us know when.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Councillor Errington, you put your name up with a suggestion. Did you want to talk to that suggestion?
Yeah, again, I think training would be really useful, because as Tim said, the variance on what enforcement cases are absolutely amazing, and I know that from my own experience. But I appreciate that putting training together, takes up more time as well. But maybe that's just something to think about. It doesn't have to be a very long presentation. Perhaps, obviously, you can't talk about live cases. But I do want to reiterate, I don't want to put that department under any more pressure. And my second point is, you say a triage. So at what point do you say that's resolved? So if something comes in, you look at it, you say, right, that can be resolved by planning permission. Is then that off the list, or do you have to then wait for the planning permission to come in and get passed? Because obviously that elongates it even further.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Essentially, if an application isn't, if we invite an application as a result of enforcement work, then that stays an enforcement complaint until such time the planning permission is granted.
Yeah. So that could be weeks, months, even a year, couldn't it? And that is why I think those, yeah.
Yeah, that's a
Thank you
point.
very much.
Thank you, Councillor Drayson.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just wanted to simply echo Councillor Errington's request for training. Don't want to lumber the officers too much, but enforcement is as important as anything else. I think we've improved the planning committee. The committee works well. But if people can get away with just ignoring the planning committee and the planning officers, then they won't ever come to us, because they can just carry on regardless. So enforcement is as important.
Thank you very much. Councillor Prochak.
Thank you, Chairman. I just so agree with Councillor Drayson. And it's not just rural areas, but particularly in the rural areas. I think rather perhaps undeservedly, gets a very bad reputation because they think that it's not worth it reporting because nothing happens. And I mean, the latest very, very controversial one is the Netherfield one, the unauthorised development, and there's a planning application in. But goodness knows how long that's going to take when we have powers to actually deal with things much, much more quickly. And I do agree that they should be divided into small offences, minor breaches that you describe, but the major ones are really, really ones we need to focus on. And it looks from the statistics that we are. It was interesting what Councillor Courtell said, that we've got the capacity of 200 and we've only done 124. But that doesn't reflect the seriousness or the whatever of the enforcement. So it is a more complicated picture than we have in front of us now, although that's a huge improvement to see the trends. And we also need to know how COVID-19 is affecting things now. You know, whether people are just saying, oh, well, they won't bother. They'll just go ahead and do what they want to do because of COVID-19. So it is a more complex situation. So the training would be good, Councillor Errington, it would be very good. And maybe we could get in a trainer that we've just had to do a session if it's too much pressure on the department.
Thank you very much. Well, I think there's some really useful comments there, and for Tim to take away, one, the league table, and to the training, and perhaps somehow looking at what a minor, what a major, so we can get some sort of perspective on it. I know that this is a real issue with members because we're all affected by it. As soon as something comes along, it is an issue, and it just seems to take so long to resolve. And it appears that there doesn't appear to be a way around it in many cases. And I think the Netherfield example is a very good example where it's very hard to appease residents when the law is working against you. So that's that. The recommendation that to be resolved, the report is noted. Juliet, I'm not sure that we need to take a vote on this. Can you advise?
We have actually made some recommendations. Obviously, you're asking for the minor and major application information, the league table, and you've also requested training. Yes. So we could actually put that down as a recommendation. So if we're going to do that, then we'll need to take a vote on that.
Well, let's do a vote in that case. Yes, Councillor Protak has moved that. Do we have a seconder? Who's seconding that? Yes, Councillor Errington seconded that.
I'll second.
Oh, we have John Barnes as well. We've got everybody, which is good.
Okay, so I'll call your names out in alphabetical order, and it's for, against, or abstain. Councillor John Barnes.
For.
Councillor Mrs. Barnes.
For.
Councillor Coleman.
For.
Councillor Curtis.
For.
Councillor Errington.
For.
Councillor Ganley.
For.
Councillor Harmer.
For.
Councillor Langlands.
For.
Councillor Madeley. Councillor Madeley. Councillor Mear.
For.
Councillor Prochak. For. Councillor Stevens.
For.
Councillor Thomas.
For.
And Councillor Vinehall.
For.
Okay, that's carried.
Thank you very much. Councillor Ganley, you've asked to say something?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Usually the last item on the agenda is date and place of the next meeting, but that's conspicuous by its absence. Is there a reason for that?
Well, that's a good question. We'll deal with that at the end, but thank you for drawing attention to that. I think it's as planned. Well, Julie can comment now. Julie, what is the date of our next meeting?
Normally the last item on the agenda is confirming when the next site visit is, and obviously site visits at the moment have been suspended because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's the reason why it's not on the agenda.
Okay, thank you.
I think the actual committee date is as per already arranged. Right. So we then move on to the item 12, which is undetermined major applications. Were there any? Does anyone have any comments or questions on those? I have one question, which I think I'm not sure who's best to answer. It's Tim or Sam. I'm just looking at this. I can't see the downs in Westfield. This is the application that Tim and I had a meeting on about a year ago because there's delays to the section 106. I think. Is that not on this list for a reason?
My understanding is that there isn't a major application that we have undetermined. It was a minor application for the drainage off-site,
okay,
which was required by a condition on the original outline.
All right.
So that's probably why it's a major application in its own right.
Okay. All right. No, thank you very much for that. Good. All right. Well, the recommendation is that this be resolved. Julie, do we need to take a vote on that?
No, you just need to get a proposer and a seconder and a general agreement.
We have just before we move on, we have Councillor Prochak and Councillor Thomas who'd like to speak. Sorry about that.
Was it Councillor Errington before me?
It was Councillor Errington before you. Very good. You're all too quick.
Thank you. Thank you. Couple of things. I thought there was a big application out at Fairlight. Have I missed that?
The Fairlight application has actually been withdrawn now.
All right. Okay. Thank you. And also, can you explain the Ellerslie Lane application appears on page 29 as delegated and 24 units, and it appears again on page 32 as 28 units and under consideration. Could you just explain whether one thing's sort of morphed into another or if it's two separate things? Thank you.
I think I might need to look into that a bit more, but I think it's nothing more than there was a couple of applications and they've both been resolved to be approved, but I suspect they're only pursuing one of them.
Yeah,
but technically, because the other one still exists, it's still there on the list.
Right. Okay. But it has been. I think it's been superseded by the 2021 with the increased numbers.
That's right.
Done. It's not two separate things, is it?
No, they've submitted. I think they've submitted the new one. I think to deal with what seems to have been the issue with pursuing the 2017 application. So, because the 2017 application there hasn't been withdrawn, it's still technically something that needs to be reported on this list. But it sounds like they're pursuing this newer scheme.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Councillor Prochak.
Thank you very much. Just that the list is useful to know, and it's quite shocking, isn't it, to see how many we're not delivering or they're not delivering. And I think that's one of the things that would be useful to know, whether it's us or them. 8 of the listed are 106 discussions, and I'm not sure who's. Is it us or them? Are we backtracking? Are we dragging our feet, or is it the actual developers? But Councillor Beinhorn, maybe also you would like to flag up the training session with the developers that might be useful for a list like this.
Yes, well, that's a good thing to flag up, and Tim can just do a very quick brief on that. That's already in the diary. Tim, do you want to just highlight what that's about?
Yes, Chair. I was going to do that after the close of the meeting, just to give us a heads up of Tuesday. Is that more appropriate to do it then?
Yeah, that's fine. That would be good, just so that everyone knows not to leave the meeting when it's finished, just so there's a bit of information on the next training session. Good, and we have Councillor Thomas.
Just to say, with Ellerslie Lane, I noticed that outside the property on Ellerslie Lane, there is a notice saying that it is to sell with planning permission for 24 houses. Just to let you know that that's the way in which it's being advertised. And just to confirm that the Ellerslie Lane development, the 28, will be coming to committee. Is that right?
I'm not quite sure I can confirm that the application will be coming to committee. I'm not aware of whether it's been called in or not, but it will go through due process. So if it's called in, then yes, or similarly, if it goes on the notification list and gets called in that way, then yes, it will come. But I'm not aware of its status at this point in time.
Okay, thanks.
Councillor Coleman?
Oh, yeah, thanks, Chair. Just while I'm thinking about it, something I flagged up a while ago about putting ward names on the weekly list and on the notified list. I just thought I'd bring that up again while I'm thinking about it, because it's very useful to know which wards applications are in sometimes.
As well, it's very particularly for Bexhill, I think. Is that something that we can do, Tim or Sam?
Yeah, sorry, Councillor Coleman, it's something we're looking into. We haven't forgotten, but yes, so yes.
Good. I mean, particularly in Bexhill, I think it's really useful. Councillor Langlands.
Just quickly to say, I did call in Ellerslie Lane, but I haven't had any response from that. So I do hope it went, but perhaps I'll chase that up.
Similarly, Councillor Langlands, I will check that for you.
Thank you very much. That's lovely. But I'll have a word with you.
Good. I think that's the end of the list of questions or comments. Julie, can we resolve that recommendation be moved? Do we have I think we had a mover, didn't we, Sue Rochak? I think you moved that.
Move that it be noted.
And could we have a seconder? Anyone? Yeah.
I'll second.
Seconded. Councillor Ganley.
Seconders now. Yeah, we've got plenty of seconders. Councillor Thomas was first up with his hand. Very good, thank you. Which takes us on to the appeals lodged, which is item 13, the last item on the agenda. Does anyone want to make any comments or do you have any questions on any of those? No? I note the one appeal allowed, which was Clench Green in Northam, which I think is one the committee actually refused. So that was interesting. It will be interesting to see why that was approved. That was one that was called in. On that note, I think we have finished the formal committee meeting. If I could ask you to stay online after the recording has completed, just there's a couple of I think Tim's got something to just update on training, and I'm sort of hoping that Nicola might be in the meeting now. I'm not sure. Tim, we were going to try and get her to introduce part of her team. Yeah.
Yes, that is the case, and hopefully she has joined. Yes.
Are you all right? So on that basis, if I could ask the clerk to finish the meeting and stop the recording and let us know when that recording is stopped.